right, let's get started. Today's topic is what's new in Prism 1.6. Good morning, everyone. My name is Richard Ning. I'm Software Development Manager at ESE Spectrum. Welcome to this internal webinar for what's new in Prism 1.6. So before we get started, let me make some announcement. Okay. So the first one is our development team is planning to host some more internal webinars on Prism product. The goal here is to make our internal support engineers and sales to get more familiar with these product features. Here is a list of some other webinars we are going to host in the next few months. So the first one here, apart from today, the first one here is how to use the new Prism installer to speed up the fresh install or upgrade from either the older system to a newer system, or if you want to do the fresh install, we are going to guide you how to do that without touching any of the database. Okay. The second one is like how to use the new admin UI to configure Prism and its current status. This will talk about the new admin UI available in both Prism 1.5 and 1.6 releases. What can be done and what we are working on in this area in the upcoming 1.7 release as well. Okay. And the third one, which we still need to schedule that. Right now, the time is probably sometime in September or October. We are going to talk about how to set up 8064 data controller with the Prism desk, including some demos and some pitfalls you might get into. So just stay tuned on this kind of webinars. We are going to send out. We already sent out 2 webinars. The first 2, I'm going to schedule the third one with the marketing team, and it's going to send it out probably sometime next month. Okay, the next one is with the help from Anna's team and also Katie here. Our internal Prism training system, the employee edition, is up and running now from Talent LMS website. Here shows a few videos that are available in this website. I also want to thanks to Brian for his support to make this happen. We will continue to add more training materials, including some of the how-to guides into this site. So if you need to have access to the Prism online training, please send an email to Anna or marketing team, or just let your manager know, and we will make sure to add you in there. Okay. Now let's turn into our today's topic. What's new in Prism 1.6? The release date for 1.6 is scheduled on August 16, which is about 4 weeks away from today. I also list some of the upcoming product release we have scheduled in this year. So in Prism 1.6, we will have about 40 features and bug fixes that will be delivered to the customers. As you will see in a moment, we have spent a significant amount of time trying to make a Prism more customer friendly and easier to configure without the need to open the database to do the setup or change the configurations. This includes things like installer, admin configuration UI, and 8064 integration and so on. Okay. So there is a lot of exciting features in this release to cover. And this webinar may take a little more than 1 hour because we really have a lot of things. We have about 160 slides to cover today. And the video of this webinar will also be available later in the in the employee training website, the Talent LMS website. So stay tuned. We are going to send out the email when the recording is available. Okay. So let's get started. Today's presenter is Doug Novy, our senior QA engineer. So welcome, Doug, to give us a presentation now.
As Rasheen mentioned, with this release, we made a big push to make it more user-friendly, to introduce more administrative controls, installation, user interfaces, and even getting the 8864 better tied in. That being said, a lot of these features were pretty challenging to develop, but I think that they're going to be good additions to the product. So let's start with the features. The Prism Server installer. Now it allows users to run Prism immediately after a new install without having to get into SQL Server and manually configure things. So this should help customers and support more easily get this stuff up and running. So before this installer was the way it was, after you installed Prism, after the installer created the database for you, a user would still have to go into the SQL database and manually configure the sites, the reporting groups, the sources, the raw points, the tags, and that's just to get the main application to be able to open. But now, after a fresh Prism install, so the database was just created new, you can go ahead and try to launch that main application, and it will prompt you for the startup session creator, the SView file wizard. And it'll walk you through creating that wizard, and you save it to your desktop or wherever, and then you can launch that SView file that you just created while in super user mode, which you accomplish by holding down the shift key. And this will open up another wizard where it walks you through creating the site object. So you'll put in information like the ORAS code, the site name, effective date, etc. And once you have all that information in, that sets up the bare minimum needed in the configuration to be able to, again, launch the main application in super user mode. And since the Prism can tell you're still missing a lot of information in the configuration, so it'll launch directly to the admin page, which you'll see here. It has a new look. We'll talk about that a little bit more later, but it'll launch you right into the admin page where the user can then add sources, tags, reporting groups, monitoring systems, instruments, etc. So the idea, like I said, from beginning to end, you're able to get this all up and running all entirely through user interfaces and not having to mess around with the database. That being said, currently you still do need to, after you get it all configured, restart the services so they can suck in all that new configuration information and get things going. Yeah, and that's, you just launch it, get something like this. All right, the Prism client installer, before in the 1.5 release, it would just install all of the client modules. But customers wanted to be able to only install the ones they cared about. So here's what the client installer looks like. You accept the license, and now you have this option here for the user to click through and say, I want the data viewer, I don't want the CGA, etc. Probably lighten the load on the customer client machines. And next, install, pretty straightforward. All right, super user mode. So if you're not familiar, super user mode, which I mentioned before, normally you would access super user mode by holding down the shift key while launching the main application. But for testing, that's not a great way to go. We need to be able to automate this stuff. So this is kind of an internal feature, but I imagine support might find a use for this too. So now we introduced, it will search for a Windows environmental variable, and based on the status of that environmental variable, Prism super user mode, it will or will not launch the main application in super user mode. So here's, if you're familiar with the environmental variable editor, this is what it would look like. All right, preview features, a new option for using new experimental features. So this one's kind of a neat approach to this. Adding the preview features option gives a means to display or hide new or experimental features. Basically, we wanted a way to put out new features to the customers in a way that they could easily opt in or out of the features. So it's kind of like a beta testing on-off switch. And this solves the problem of like, how can we introduce new features to our customers without trying to get them on board with a beta testing program and without disrupting their normal workflows. So there's a couple different ways to have the preview features on. In that SView file, you can add this additional node, preview features enabled, true or false, or you can just, when you're in the main application, click the settings flyout, and now there's this new checkbox down at the bottom right for preview features. And so when preview features is on, you have access to a lot of the beta stuff that we're introducing. Right. So now Prism systems add toast notifications. If you're not familiar, toast notifications, it's the little, in Windows, the little pop-ups in the bottom right that Windows can have pop-ups, or whatever application you're using can have pop-ups. These are toast notifications. In other words, Prism is leveraging those to better embed it into Windows, to use the Windows native notification and message system. And not only does it use those, a user can actually create and schedule messages and then see a history of the messages that has been sent to the Windows Toast notification system. So to be able to mess with this, you launch the main application, go to the admin tab, go to clients, and then application messages. And when you're in there, you'll see all the historical messages sorted out, and you can click add. And when you're in there, it gives you the option to schedule it to expire from so many minutes from now, or a certain date and time, or the current session. You can supply the message and so on. Things like this may be useful for reminding people to do certain tasks or calibrations or whatnot. And then when you do such a thing, you'll get this Toast notification pop-up message. And it'll also, just like the Windows taskbar down there, you'll see the little notification icon with the number of notifications you have on deck. And here's another example of what it would look like. All right. Prism configuration, admin menu, new look and feel. I'm going to breeze through this one real quick because, as was mentioned before, we're going to have an entire webinar dedicated to this and a few other features. So I just wanted to show this because the Prism team has been focused on providing a better experience for support and the customers when they're messing around and configuring Prism. And as part of that, the dev team reworked the whole admin UI to be more intuitive with more of a modern interface. So if you navigate to admin, you'll see something like this. You have the expected values page here, where you have like bottle managers and expected values, things associated with calibration sequences. And in security, things like users and groups, roles and permissions, just like login stuff. Under clients, application messages, which we were just talking about, and then startup sessions, which is a way to create and modify new SView files. And server and devices, this is where you really start to get into some of the configuration things, like configuring your alarms, your trends, your sources, tags, etc. Part 75, you get into monitoring plans, instrumentation, Appendix E curves, etc. SIMs and site, there's the object associations, which we'll talk about more later, and sample types. And then finally, there's an about page where a user can click these hyperlinks and get to the release notes, to the help desk, user guide, or go straight to the ESC Spectrum website. Keeping in with the, improving the user interface, the trend administration user interface was updated. And previously, the alarms administration was reworked with this new interface. And once we got that UI pattern all laid out and figured out, it's now been applied to the trends administration. So now if you go to the trends administration, you'll see something like this, where there's a few main parts here. On the left-hand side, the number 1 area, you have all your filtering controls. You can really dig in on what you're trying to find. And the number 2 area, you can search for different trend items, and you can toggle between view and edit mode. If you're not aware of view, it's kind of intuitive. You can see everything, you just can't change it. And then edit mode, you could access edit mode and start making changes to the trend groups and the trend items, etc. You get your trend group listing where you can sort and whatnot. In the box number 5, upper right, you get the trend group details, and down the bottom right, you have the trend items. So the specific tags and such that are within the trend group. So you can filter, as I mentioned, you can filter all these items, really kind of dig in. And the trend group, as you're doing this, as you're building this trend group, there's actually validation as you're going through, so it won't let you build something that doesn't make sense as you're doing it. And in the trend items, these are the specific tags that are part of the trend group. Also, validation is immediate. It'll prevent you from building things that are nonsense. All right. Another new site administration screen is Site View. Right now, this is under the preview features. So if you wanted to be able to see the site view, you'd have to make sure preview features was turned on. But if you're familiar with Stack Vision, they have a Semscape feature, which is a user interface that allows people to see the landscape of how all of the variables are related, how the parameters and whatnot are related. And so Prism needed something like that, to help customers visualize and see how everything's connected. And I know for me, this was pretty helpful when I was first learning Prism because it allowed me to see the hierarchy of how everything was related in Prism. So it gave like a 1,000-foot view of how this is all connected. So I think it's a pretty awesome feature. So like I said, preview features, the site view is read only. So you're not going to get in there and break anything. It's just for looking at stuff. And currently only the tag information and bottle details are displayed, but in the future, more and more of this information will get added into the feature. So preview features is turned on, you navigate through the admin to get to site view, and you'll see something like this where I'm clicking through, I can see the reporting system, the reporting groups, the monitoring system, maybe some qualification parameters, and so you could just see this whole tree view of how the system is laid out. All those descriptions and names are nonsense, by the way. I just had it scramble some text so that we weren't actually looking at a customer system. And like I said, on the right-hand side where it says the data is not currently available, in the future, more and more of that will be added, but right now it's limited to only a few items where it gives you the full details on the right-hand panel. All right, integrate the 8864 configuration with Prism. As was mentioned before, this deserves its own webinar, and it's going to get one. It's the 8864 has a lot of nooks and crannies about in its features, and so I'm just going to kind of breeze through this, but still worth mentioning. So basically, Prism needed a way to easily configure the 8864 to work with it, and so that means analog inputs, which are standard averaging channels, analog outputs, which are math channels with controller constants, digital inputs, which had to update the digital input labels in the 8864, as well as creating Modbus channels, and same thing with the digital outputs. And then finally, the server.cfg to be able to configure Modbus. So I thought it would be cool to put a little demo in here of just how quick it is to be able to completely reprogram an 8864 after a cold start. So the next demo is starting with a cold started 8864 and then using Prism to completely reprogram it. So here you can see we got an 8864. I check and there's no channels set up. And there's Prism with just a bunch of tags, analog inputs, analog outputs. So you navigate into the admin and the source configuration, and there's my source. I go into edit mode, and now I'm gonna edit the point configuration. And we'll talk more in detail about this shortly, but you can see here's all my different analog inputs, here's all my analog outputs. These have all been configured. All I have to do is just have the Prism download this configuration data to the logger. And I'm just kind of clicking through just to take a look at them all. So that all looks good. I hit download all points, and now this is going. I'm hearing somebody else on the mic.
Program at 8.
Great. So now it's go ahead and it's sending all the command response string to the 8864 and it's configuring it. You can see it's creating all those Modbus channels there. And it's going to take a second. It's working through. And so now I'm going to navigate to the Modbus portion of the 8864 configuration. So go back to admin, source configuration, switch to edit mode, and now there's the edit 8864 Modbus configuration. And so here there's already a server.cfg in the system, Oh, looks like it just finished downloading all the channels, but let's see if there's a, looks like there's no server.cfg in the logger right now. So we need one to get in there, hit the download to device, download successful. So now I look at the logger again, and Viola, we have a server.cfg. So now Prism's going to start catching up and pulling from the 8864 as expected. So that was from cold start to completely configure 8864 and pulling data as it should in enough time to just fit it into like a 2-minute GIF. All right. So, as mentioned, to get to the point configuration, you go admin, server and devices, source control, and make sure you're in edit mode, or else you can't even access those things. And you edit the point configuration, and then you get into here and see all your analog inputs, outputs, etc. Now, I've been talking about these 4 different data point types. There's analog inputs, outputs, digital inputs, and digital outputs, and they all have kind of a different way that they work. So let's kind of walk through these real quick. The data flow for an analog input is you have some physical device that's being read into the 8864 as a raw reading, which then has an associated A-type channel, the standard averaging channel. And then Prism pulls that data in, and that ends up in your source tables, and then that gets rolled up into your tag data. So Prism needs to be able to configure all that stuff in the 8864 box. And so it looks like this. You would go to analog inputs. I don't have anything set up. I can do create default, and it will pre-populate all these fields with the information. And when you hit save, it went ahead and downloaded it right away. And now you can see in the 8864 that channel was just created for me. So the pre-populations here, it will, if you use create default, it will pre-populate the name with the tag's name, and then the units of measure associated with that raw point. And you can see how that maps to the 8864 channel configuration. And then the scale high and low is coming from the raw point parameters information in Prism. And it will default to using a 4 to 20 milliamp signal unless you specify otherwise. And let's say you created that, you saved that, it downloaded, and then you left and came back later. This is what you would see. This is what it would look like if you wanted to edit that point after the fact. Note that you can change everything there except for the name, right? Because in the 8864, you can't just rename a channel. You have to delete it and rebuild it. So the same is true here. So just keep that in mind if you do all this. If you delete the channel here, it doesn't delete the channel in the 8864. The same thing is true in Stack Vision. That's a feature, not a bug. Right? Analog outputs, a little bit more complicated. The way the analog outputs work is that Prism drives the value in the logger by controlling a controller constant, which is the only thing inside of a math channel equation, which then drives an analog output. And then Prism will read back. It writes the controller constant, but it can't read that directly, so it just reads back the math channel. Right? So you create default, and when it does this, see it creates this this math channel for us with, in this case, the equation is just looking at controller constant K1. And then it also creates that analog output point for us. So you get the engineering units high and low, and the 4 to 20 milliamps. So it created both of these things for us. And you could edit it like this after the fact. All right, with digital inputs, if you're not familiar, you have some physical device and it writes to some physical card spot in the 8864, but it could also be pseudo digital inputs, just the same. And Prism actually, to get those status of those digital inputs, it actually uses Modbus to pack all 16 bits of those digital inputs into a Modbus channel, and then it just reads that whole channel at once and unpacks those bits to get the digital statuses. So when you go to create a digital input, all you have to do is give it a name, and that name corresponds with the label, which is assigned to the digital input. And then based on the address of that raw point, it will create the associated Modbus channels, which hold all those packed bits. So this greatly simplifies this process for us. And same thing with the digital outputs, pretty much the same hierarchy. It will, based on the addressing, create both the Modbus channel, and then given the name that you give it, it will reassign the digital label. All right. So we've been talking, I mentioned Modbus. We also have a Modbus editor, which I feel like this is a pretty cool feature, having dealt with Modbus stuff a lot. But here you can see this 8864 doesn't have a Modbus server.cfg in it. So we can come in here, edit 88 Modbus, the thing. We can hit add new file, and we just give it a name. Just gonna call it example server.cfg here, and hit create. And it will give us a template. If you're not familiar, this is just a bare bones server.cfg. There's no commands in here, but it gives you all the information you need to be able to build one. And I just made some trivial edit, hit save, and it's going to confirm. And it downloaded to the logger. So now if we take a look at the logger, you can see that that server.cfg got put in place. Right. And another cool thing about this Modbus editor is that it actually hangs on to all the historical versions. So every time you download and create a new server.cfg, it'll get added to this listing. And so I feel like this is very helpful for support and other people who have to deal with this, because maybe the customer says, hey, we took that instrument out. I need you to revert the system back to how it was behaving back in February, whatever. You can go and look at this listing and see what the server.cfg was there in place back then, or just the history of it in general. And in fact, you can create copies based off the old versions and re-implement them. So having this historical thing here, I feel like it's a very valuable part of what this is doing for us now. Okay. And so when you're in this Modbus editor, down at the bottom left, you can see you can add new server.cfgs where it just gives you that template file, or you can copy an existing one. Like, for example, copying one of the old versions and you just want to make some edits to it. And then within the editor pane here, you can copy, cut, and paste text, undo, redo, save, and discard, and then lock. Locking is used to just, once a server.cfg file is locked, you can't edit it anymore. And so that's to preserve the history of the files. You can only have one file that you're able to edit at a time, and locked just basically puts it in archive. All right, so in the Prism system, we added the ability to add a new trend via copying. So by using the copy from existing feature, a user can create a new trend with the same options and trend points as an existing trend. And after creating that copy, a user can then modify the trend. So this is just kind of a time saver. Open Prism, navigate through admin, server devices, trend configuration, and you'll see something like this. And make sure you're in edit mode again. Click on the existing trend of interest. You'll see the details on the right. And there's this copy from button that's over there. And you click that and it'll ask you, where do I want it? What's the new version name that I'm creating? You put in that stuff, select private or public, and hit done. And now you have a new trend group added to the list that's a clone of the previous one. And now a user can go in and make edits to that new trend group. Maybe just change the time span, for example, some small thing that they wanted to add without having to redo it all. All right, Business Object Association Editor. People who have been doing support with Prism, who've been in the nitty gritty of it, they probably are familiar with the Business Object Association system. But in case you're not, this was a UI added so that a user can create these business object associations without having to go and do all the work directly in the SQL tables as it was before. So for example, maybe support or customers, they could use this to easily create an association between, let's say, a probe and a tag which holds that probe's pressure or temperature data, for example. So that way on the home page, adjacent to the probe, you could also see its associated data like the probe temperature and probe pressure. And so if you, again, navigate through admin, send to site, and you get to the object associations, you'll see something like this, where the left-hand side is the object associations, and then the right-hand side is the associated details of whichever object association you have selected. So we can create a new one here by select your category. And then on the right-hand side, you can select the two things that you're associating and save it. All right, Alarms Administration Action Tab User Interface. So this, making this change allows for more immediate feedback when creating and editing alarm actions, which, by the way, were previously called alarm outputs. And this is kind of keeping up with the alarms configuration redesign that we had done before. The goal here is to, again, make it more user-friendly, reduce the number of clicks and screen visits for the user in order to edit or create an alarm action. So if you get in here, this is what you'll see into the Action tab. On the left-hand side, same format that we've been doing. You have the filters on the left-hand side, and then you have the listings of all the different alarm actions. You can search. There's the view and the edit, and then the right-hand side, you have the details on whatever alarm action you have selected. So you can filter by like email, the output tag, whether it's active, inactive. They can be sorted alphabetically, and you can even search using a search bar. And so if you went to go add a new alarm action, you would see a little wizard like this. And then as you're going through, the validation is immediate. So again, it's going to try to keep us from creating nonsensical things. All right, add muted alarm count to the alarm bar. In Prism, a user can mute an alarm so it doesn't display in the bottom ribbon. Maybe these are alarms that pop up, but they don't really, they don't need immediate attention. But if they're muted, it's still probably good to keep somewhat of an eye on them. So what we did here is we added a little counter to the alarm bar where you can see a tally of how many active muted alarms are in place right now. So get into Prism, you navigate to alarms, and you can pick some alarm and you can hit mute. And so this will mute it. It won't be making all that fuss anymore. And so you can see down in that bottom bar there, all those service alarms and Spectra Pack alarms, those are not muted. So they're there flashing to get the user's attention. But on the bottom right-hand corner, now there's that counter, that 56 that's shown there. That's the count of all the muted alarms. And so let's say you see that count and you're like, wow, that number is going up really fast, or you just want more information about it. You can hover over it and it gives you a little bit of information. And then you can click on it and it will actually navigate you right to the alarms panel, showing you all those muted alarms. So if you start seeing that tally jump up, you can just quickly navigate to this alarms panel. All right, add QA alarms for perm ratio QA event config. If you're not familiar, there's calibrations that are associated with mercury analyzers, and there's a thing called a perm ratio, and we added the ability to create these QA alarms associated with that specific value if they get out of whack. Yep. All right, data editor. So now we have an admin screen. We have a user interface for the data overrides. So back in Prism 1.5, we added data overrides where you could override specific data on certain ranges and whatnot. But it was only, it was like kind of a back-end feature. You had to get into SQL and configure the tables to create those data overrides. There was no user interface for support or a customer to be able to easily do it. So now in Prism 1.6, we created a user interface within the data editor normal workflow for support or whoever to do these things. So if you're in the data editor, you would do a new task and you would get into the overrides and you would see something like this, where kind of pick your points and then run through, and you have a confirmation, and you can include comments just like you would for doing a recalc or anything else in the data editor. All right, again, data editor module, record analog data points when marking data bad. So when you use the data editor, you can mark data points as bad or missing. And when you do that, Prism will record like the user, the action, the perform date. It just kind of keeps a log of these changes that you're making. But it didn't record which points you were actually changing. But now they do. So some common scenarios where this might be helpful is, let's say an operator accidentally chooses the wrong point when he's marking the data bad. You'll be able to see, in the history, which points were marked bad. Or maybe support gets asked to mark all the same points as they did on some previous ticket, and maybe that was a last quarter, so there's no history of it. You could look at this history in Prism and see, oh, this is exactly what I did last time. Searching for points marked bad is pretty tedious, both on qualification tables and numbered differently, and data flags appear in different columns. So again, this helps the user drill down and find what they had done to the system previously. So you would get into the data editor, click new task, and you would get into the data editor wizard, and you have this flag data missing option. Click on that, go next, and you just run through the stuff as per usual with the date, time, pick your points, do all your verification, leave a comment if you're a good support engineer, and click finish. And now if you look at that edit history, you can see that it actually lists off the points that were edited that were marked bad during that workflow. All right, linear module added the current relative accuracy. So yeah, adds the current relative accuracy to linearity module so that it is visible for each run, and it's included in the right-hand column during the linearity tests. So now when you're running a linearity test, you have this new column, the RA, which will just show you that relative accuracy as it's going through. Again, with the linearity and CGA modules, allow linearity tests in CGA to start with invalid bottles. It was a request that we provide the ability to perform these linearity tests with a bottle that doesn't quite satisfy the concentration requirements. And you may ask, like, why would you want to do that? Well, sometimes you want to use bottles that are slightly outside the acceptable ranges just to be used as a quick sanity check. And so now if you go to do that, it'll give you a little warning and say, hey, the bottle you selected doesn't meet the concentration requirements. Please acknowledge. And it'll even put that in the SEMS log that this thing was done with a bottle that wasn't quite right. Now, we added that ability to use basically the wrong bottle, and so we needed to make sure that that information propagated down to the relevant reports. And so that's what we did here. This is an example of the linearity report. And now this is an example of that linearity report where an invalid bottle was used. And so it adds that tag, that red invalid bottle, just to make sure that this report, it's like having a big asterisk on it, All right, ECMPS, fuel flow to load, ECMPS check code, blah, blah, in progress reference check. As some of you might be familiar, there was a change with the ECMPS recently to introduce this fuel flow to load test code. And so it has now been implemented into Prism as it should be. All right, on to the bug fixes. Just for the sake of making this presentation a little bit shorter, I actually removed several bug fixes. So I just left the ones that I thought were most important. Here, if a user was toggling around through the alarm panel, some combination of clicking acknowledge and mute and toggling between them would sometimes cause the whole thing to freeze up, and you'd have to close the whole main application and reopen it to be able to get things back to normal. And so since then, in this new version, we've fixed that. So you can see I'm just trying to stress it out by clicking around, muting, unmuting, acknowledging, etc. And we don't have that freeze anymore. All right, there was an issue where the active checkbox did not work as it should have for the alarm output. So in other words, if a user went and checked the active, or it didn't actually update right away in the actions table the way it should have. But now when you check the active, inactive, it updates immediately as expected. All right, there was a problem where data messages did not respect the is active status. In other words, you would have an instrument that was expired, let's say, it was no longer active, but it was still giving you warnings and notifications and alarms based on that. But now it actually looks to make sure it's active before it starts giving you alarms about that thing. All right, this one, I'm gonna probably skip through this animation because it's a little long, but the gist of it is that when you're using the bottle manager, let's say you're building your bottle information here and you're working through it, but then halfway through it, you hit cancel. There was an issue where when you went to go add another bottle again, it wouldn't start at the beginning of the wizard. It would start further down the wizard, which, doesn't really make sense. So now if you go and let's say we retire a bottle. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. Yeah, I'm sorry. This would let you, the problem was that you could retire a bottle, but then continue to edit it. But now when you retire the bottle, it disappears immediately. This is the other one I was talking about, where you would go to add a new bottle, and if you canceled out, it would allow you to, you canceled out and then reopen the wizard, it would open the wizard in the wrong spot. In other words, anytime you open the wizard, it should start at the beginning, and there was a bug where it wasn't doing that. All right, service refresh does not refresh sequence running status. Yeah, so there was an issue found in 1.1.5 as part of some other testing that the refresh of a service did not refresh the sequence status of a running sequence. So if there was a communication error with the device during a sequence run and the service refresh button was pressed, then the calibration now running, it wouldn't resume the sequence when the connection was reestablished. So now if there's a failure in communication, the calibration status, once the communication comes back online, it'll pick up where it left off. And so kind of what that would look like, let's say we have a device sequence that's running right now, and then for whatever reason, communication fails. Somebody trips over the Ethernet cord to the 8864, loses communication for a second, and the user on Prism sees that communication error and tries to refresh the service. And then sometime after that, the refresh completes, but the error is still there. And then someone realizes what the problem is, plugs 8864 back on, and you would expect to be able to continue seeing the calibration status. And that's what it does now. It gets plugged back in, and now the user can still continue to observe the now running calibration sequence. All right, so when importing a new monitor plan, there was an issue where it would put a default date of 01010001, which didn't really make sense. It was kind of a weird thing to say. So now when you do this, when you first import it, it'll say new, and then once you hit save, it will actually populate the current date and time at the moment you hit save in that field. With the qualifier service, there was an issue where the rounding was not always correct. This is very much an edge case here, but occasionally the qualifier service was found to be incorrectly rounding compliance limits that use qualification parameters with more than 2 decimal places as the limit. This didn't apply to the constant limits though. Basically, it was truncating the value rather than rounding the value. So for example, the original value is on the left. You have the 0.5045197. And previously, the qualifier service would chop it off right there between the 4 and the 5, whereas what it should have done was rounded that 4 and 5. So it should have been 0.505 rather than 0.504. All right, another bug fix was Part 75, maintenance and calibration hour, 15-minute separation rule. So if you're not familiar, there's a rule with Part 75 parameters where if you're in a calibration or maintenance hour, the 2 data points must be at least 15 minutes apart. And if they're not, it doesn't actually count as a valid hour. And before, Prism actually wasn't respecting that rule. It's very much a edge case. So for example, let's say we have some data here all the way from 12 to 1300, and all that data is offline except the 10th minute and the 20th minute. They are online and in maintenance, but they're only 10 minutes apart. So before, Prism would have thought this was valid because it had those 2 data points, but now it actually applies that rule. It says, well, those 2 data points are only 10 minutes apart. They needed to be at least 15 minutes apart, so this is an invalid hour. All right, database step fails when use Windows authentication option is used. This has to do with the server installer. Basically, if you're creating a new database, SQL requires that you have sysadmin credentials. And there was an issue where if you were trying to use the Windows authentication to create that database and it didn't have sufficient permissions, the installer would fail. And so now the installer checks that the credentials you provided are sufficient before it tries to run the installer, or complete the installation, I should say. And along the same lines, there was a server installer failing with Windows authentication when you were using Windows authentication for both the database stuff and the services stuff. For reasons outside the scope of this presentation, you cannot use the Windows authentication to both access the database and to run the services which are communicating with the database. So the installer has been updated so that if you use Windows authentication for the database, it will not let you use Windows authentication for services, and vice versa. If you do not use Windows authentication for the database, you can use them for the services. Or if you wanted, you could type in the credentials for both the database and the services and not use Windows authentication at all. Right? There was an issue with the 1.5 server install, uninstall, where sometimes when you run the uninstall on 1.5, it would fail on the data collector step. And you'd have to, try it multiple times, pretty annoying. So this issue was discovered and fixed in 1.6. So now when you go to uninstall it, it just uninstalls as expected. Right. Here, there was an application service status that wasn't updating correctly. So basically, what I'm doing here is you have your services all up and running, and let's say for whatever reason, a service stops. So I'm stopping the data broadcast service. You would expect Prism to right away in that service listing to update, but it wasn't. You would actually have to close the main application and reopen it. So not very helpful. But now, here we have all the services running right now, and I'm gonna go ahead and stop the data collector service. And so once it stops, we should expect Prism right away to reflect that information. You shouldn't have to reboot the main application to see that update. And so now the service has stopped. See in the top right, now it's saying there's a problem. All right. And that's all the things. Any questions?
I'm only seeing one, and it is, are there plans to make a Prism services helper similar to Stack Vision?
I think that's a question for Landon or Rasheen. I would love to see it though.
I think that we can do that. No, it's not a big deal. It's just that we haven't gotten into that. So sending the request for I'll create a use story in our 1.7 planning, and we can do that. Just have a way to stop individual services, start a service, those kind of things. We can do that. It's pretty easy actually. All right. Thank you guys. I'll see you next time then. Thank you, Doug. That's the end of today's webinar. Again, all these recordings will be available in our training website. So thank you again. I'll see you next time. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.